Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my book corner. Today we're continuing with Don't Die July Horror Month with a book that it's a small book, but there's a whole lot to this one. Psychic Teenage Bloodbath by Carl John Lee, an extreme horror novel. And oh boy, this is a thing. I had never heard of Splatterpunk before. Now I have, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. So we'll talk about the story, the characters, the atmosphere as well that this book puts out rather than world building. Then going to go into the positives and negatives and my final thoughts at the end. But before that, I am actually going to do a content warning for some of the things that are in this book. I think this is all of them, but there's a lot. So just be aware the following things are in this book in varying levels of detail: gore, disemboweling, excrement, sex involving teenage-aged characters, sexual violence and mutilation, paedophilia, graphic gore, body horror, including but not exclusive to parts of the body including eyes and teeth, homophobia and lesbophobia, self-harm, suicide, bullying, infanticide, necrophilia, and cannibalism. All those things are in this book that is about 200 pages long. So this is definitely not going to be one for everybody. Now we've got that out of the way, let's just jump into this one. First thing to get out of the way, it is on the front cover of the book, and I've already touched on it in terms of sort of trigger warnings. However, this is an extreme horror novel, and I need to emphasize that very, very clearly. It says it on the front cover of the book, and I foolishly didn't believe that it'd be as bad as it was in that regard. And even the foreword, which for once I actually read, also goes into the fact that this is what this book is like, and it gives you ample warning, and I still wasn't prepared for this. But the story itself is an interesting one, because it's a story of basically a vengeful possession of by somebody who's still alive. So you have Charlie and Susan are kind of the two main characters, and they go to the end of year prom basically, and Susan is very bullied in school by the popular kids, and she's been convinced to wear this nice dress and she looks amazing, and it's the same dress as one of the bullies is wearing. So to get away from everything, Charlie and Susan sort of sneak off, and they have a key to get into like a room that overlooks the dance hall with like a skylight. However, when Charlie goes to get drinks for them both before coming back, just while Susan recenters herself after the ordeal with the bullies go in demanding that she removes her dress, and how dare she wear it. A few seconds later, Susan comes crashing down through the skylight in front of the entire school. Charlie notices the bullies sort of slipping out of the door that she'd gone through and sneaking away, putting two and two together that they were responsible for this accident, and you now have a half-naked teenage girl in the middle of a dance floor. Fast forward a year, and Susan is still in a coma in hospital, and Charlie's now becomes kind of the butt of the bullies in many regards, and is very much has a lot of the name calling and the snide comments that you'd actually get in this sort of situation. Unfortunately, as the case was, this was set in the 70s, so it wasn't as accepting as we are now. After one of these sort of bullying incidents, she goes to get changed in the changing rooms after physical education, and all her clothes are stolen. Now, there is a character in the book whose name I have forgotten who becomes the love interest for Charlie. Manages to get most of the clothes back, but there's still a few things missing, and as it turns out, those things that were missing was her underwear, and the bullies gave it to one of the creepy teachers with a love letter aimed to him from Charlie. And it's made very clear early on in the book that this character is a bit of a skis, and he decides that he needs to punish Charlie for this in ways that are no longer legal. As this is beginning to happen, however, and he starts to admit corporal punishment, suddenly his behaviour changes and he starts doing it to himself, saying, "Why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself?" Charlie's really confused by this and runs away, but not before witnessing some things that happen next, which I'm not going to go on in here. And this is where you discover that Susan has gained the ability to take over people's bodies, to possess them. And during this possession, she can make them do pretty much anything that she wants them to do. And she's on a course for vengeance initially. First of all, trying to protect her girlfriend Charlie, and then trying to deal with everybody who's hurt her, the people who caused this accident. And this is where the bloodbath truly begins, and it starts graphic and it only gets more graphic the further in you get. And at very rapid fire, this becomes a complete gore fest in very interesting and creative ways. Eventually, Susan does kind of see the relationship that's beginning to blossom between Charlie and the new sort of girlfriend, and the jealousy sets in, mixed with the insanity that she's gone through after being stuck in a coma in her own body for a year. And nobody is safe at that point, and you then have the end of the story. How do we deal with this plane walking, basically taking over people? How will we ever be safe? Well, we've got to kill her. And the final act is going to the hospital to try and turn off the life support and end her once and for all. It's a really interesting story. It's actually a really good framing device for a horror story. Obviously been done elsewhere before, but the specifics here are actually quite interesting as well. And it's what actually kept me reading through the book, if I'm completely honest, because this is not my type of horror in general, but really strong story. Yeah. I would argue there's three main characters here. We're going to start with Susan, as she is the antagonist of the story in many regards. And Susan has been bullied repeatedly and for years for being a lesbian and being in a relationship with Charlie. Her family aren't accepting of her choices for reasons I will never understand. And this is actually shown a bit later on, which we'll touch on in atmosphere and world building. And because of all this, she has no self-confidence. She won't say boo to a goose. She's very much trying to just go through everything in school and just avoid being seen. And then you have what happens after she falls into the coma, and how she becomes twisted as a person because of what has happened and her experiences beforehand, and the fact that she's stuck in this body and she goes insane, basically. Then you have the girlfriend, Charlie. Now, Charlie at the start is far more confident, more willing to stand up for herself. The bullies don't really bother her, but after the accident, she becomes the target for the bullies. And when it fast forwards to about a year later, you actually see some bullying incidents here that she suffers from, and she's taken a knock for confidence. And just like Susan before her, she's trying to get through the day without being noticed. She still goes to see Susan every day, or at least as often as she can. There's a picture frame at the hospital where she keeps putting the picture of the two of them together when they were happy together, and even though Susan's mother keeps taking it out and probably burning it because she's an idiot. And, you know, she's still very much in love with Susan, but she's lonely and she's isolated and alone, and obviously suffering all the bullying and the stigma with being the girlfriend, first of all, and secondly, the girlfriend of somebody who fell through a skylight and is in a coma in hospital in the middle of the end of year dance. The final character who's introduced after Susan's fall is Lynette. Now, Lynette was bullied out of her previous school. She has a history of self-harm and suicide attempts, and she's very much the emotional centre for Charlie in this. Charlie suffers a bullying incident, and due to that, they sort of end up bonding, and they develop a really sweet relationship, and that ends up being sort of the catalyst for Susan's insanity towards the entire world. And she's learned to not so much deal with the bullies, but deal with the mental side of it through acts of meditation, and that also becomes quite important later on in the book. The rest of the cast, even, let's try English, don't quite do so well, as due to the length of the book. they tend to fall into your stereotypes. So you've got your jocks, you've got your hangers-ons, the popular kids, and you've got your head cheerleader, the popular pretty girl in school, who is very much the bully as well. But they're all roles we know from other media. They fit the parts perfectly fine, they do the job and help enhance the story. So again, the characterization makes sense for everybody in here, and there are arcs as well for the three mains, so that's good to see. So in terms of atmosphere, right at the start of this book, this has a really strong opening for me in terms of setting the stage of the feel of what the school's like and what the primary characters of Susan and Charlie in particular are going through and what you can expect. And it gives you like a peek of what might be coming, but not enough for it to be obvious straight away. But it's when the blood literally starts to hit the fan that this gets really well written. I am not a fan, as I've said before, of this type of horror, but I cannot deny that the writing here is exceptionally strong. The interesting thing is how detailed it stops being the further into the book that you get, unless I was just becoming numb to it, which is distinctly possible. The first couple of incidents are incredibly graphic, very in-depth descriptions, and I felt further into the book it went, the less detailed it became. Now part of that is because there was just so much going on by the back third of the book that there was no way in a 200-page book you can describe all of this. And there's some things in here that, whilst they're not glossed over, they're barely more than mentions as much as anything else, to the point where they probably didn't even need to be there. Infanticide is the key one that I will mention here, as it's not lingered on at all, which is a good thing because I don't want to read that. But other things that are really uncomfortable also are, and whilst it isn't to my personal taste, I can appreciate how well written this is, and it does a really good job of getting across that sense of horror to you. So in terms of all that, it's really good, if really bleak. Positives and negatives. Now this is actually, in a bizarre way, going to sound incredibly positive, and this is kind of going to be at odds with my final thoughts at the end. But first things first, it's a really good story. The framing device of the person in a coma basically going insane and possessing people around them, and in fact at one point pretty much an entire hospital, is a really compelling story to tell as a story of a vengeful spirit. Because normally, in that sort of situation, the spirit's dead. Right here, the body's still alive, even if it's not willing. So that's really good. There's some solid characterization as well for your three mains. And the other point I would say is this is really well written. Not to my taste, but I cannot deny how well written this story is. On the negatives, however, the negatives is how graphic this is. This isn't a book for most people. If you're a fan of this genre, you will love it, I have no doubt. But this is a very specific niche book. And the other minor criticism, but again this is a novella, is that some of the characterization for some of the supporting cast is quite cliche in some places. But yeah, that's the positives and negatives. This book, more than any other book that I've reviewed, has got me really conflicted, and there's a number of reasons for that. This is clearly not a book aimed at me, and it is so far outside my normal taste. I picked this up because of TikTok, so thanks TikTok. But that being said, just because I don't like it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad book, and I cannot deny that the story, the writing and the characterization are all there, but it's wrapped up in such a gory body horror mess that it left me very heavily desensitized in places. So what I would say is that this is going to go in the okay category for me, and it's going to do that for a couple of different reasons. For most people, this is going to be an avoid. For me personally, I would say this is an avoid, because it's not a bad book, but it's one that I never want to read again. On the flip side, if you are a fan of this style of horror, Splatterpunk, I think you'll love it. I think you'll adore this book, even though it's really, really disgusting in some places. And so I think people who like this would put this in the GOAT category. So if I'm taking the two and having it, that puts it in okay. For those that like it or love it, everybody else, don't go near it. Well, that was Psychic Teenage Bloodbath by Carl John Lee, an extreme horror novel. Have you read this or any of Lee's other works? What did you think of them? Let me know in the comments below. I'll catch you next time.